over crest opens maybe into 6 crest, 200, 6 crest, 400, 6 crest and 6 crest, 50 to stop. Yes, spot on. That'll do for me, eh?
We've just listened to the final moments of the final stage, the 1995 Network Q Rally GB, of course, when Colin McCrae and Derek Room were crowned the FIA World Rally Champions. We thought we'd make a very special documentary series over the next 2 episodes of this podcast, and it's all about 95, not necessarily from the perspective of Colin, but of course he will be mentioned, as will Derek, as will ProDrive throughout, but from some of the other teams and some of the other people behind the scenes of what was going on while this, I suppose, really famous season now. We got our first British world champion, but it was, for me, it was when rallying became mainstream. Just for that short period of time, we definitely got mainstream. We really did. And the average man on the street was talking about rallying again. So I thought it was a really good time to look back on 95 with the people who were there. And pre-internet, pre-social media and all those things, my thirst for knowledge on rallying, on results, was always one of CFAX, teletext, getting motorsport news every Wednesday when it came out, having a cheeky glance perhaps at Autosport and WH Smith's while I was there, and if I was really lucky, picking up Rally Sport magazine also. For me, Anti-Beep, the BBC here in the UK, was really important. Without them, I probably wouldn't know half the things that were going on, and I certainly wouldn't be able to recognise some of the things as the teams, the liveries and things like that, all things that we take for granted today, the things that we can see in an instant. These are the things that perhaps we have to be a little bit more patient and wait for to see moving images of these famous Group A machines. And for me, the voice of rallying will always be Mark James. Mark James has been splattered throughout my love of rallying for many years, and of course we're very privileged, we've had him on the podcast several times, but for me it was a really good place to start, because Mark always was there with the coverage and with the words and with the drivers and everything else. So for me, it was a really good place to start this documentary, is to listen to what Mark had to say about his introduction into doing the coverage in 95, and of course how the season finished.
This is Absolute Rally, the season of 95.
For me, 1995 was huge because it was the first year that I covered the entire championship. I'd covered the RAC rally for local radio or for whoever really in the past, but I'd gone freelance at the end of 1994, and I was working for a chap called Greg Strange. And Greg came into the office one day in January and said, "Do you think rallying would work on the radio?" And I said, "Yeah, I think that's great. I hadn't really thought about it, but yeah, I think that would be really good." He said, "Yeah, so do I. We're off to Monte Carlo next week." And that was the start of it. And he'd had a conversation with a group called the World Rally Teams Association that were trying to raise world rallying's profile. And Greg had said, off the top of his head, "I think we've got something here." And I know Mark's into rallying and he's now freelance, so he's got all the time in the world. So, you know, if we can send him off around the world and report on these things, would somebody pay for it? And they said yes. So 95 was the start of it all. So we turned up in Monte Carlo. When I look back at it, we were so naive. We'd ordered an ISDN line, which in those days was quite fancy because it was a digital line, which originally was for data, was for computers to talk to each other. But there was a company called Glen Sound in the UK that made a piece of kit that now is everywhere. And it was an ISDN box. It was like a mixer. You could plug microphones and tape recorders and headphones into it, plug it into an ISDN line, and instead of having these ridiculously expensive music lines that broadcasters had to use in the past, you could have these ad hoc digital lines put in, and you could then go live in really good quality from anywhere. So that's what we did. And we couldn't get it to work, and we had to get the engineers out. Then we discovered there was a French issue with some of the technology. Anyway, it worked eventually, just before the rally. So we did stuff for local radio, and as the year went on, we started doing stuff for the BBC, for 5 Live, for the World Service. I think we did a couple of pieces. But of course, we went into it not ever dreaming that it would be the Colin Championship year. We went into it to raise the profile of the entire championship, and judging by people's comments that they were listening to us on 5 Live and on local radio stations and things, that's what we did. And it was it was a real eye-opener when, towards the end of the year, that people were taking us so seriously, because, of course, you go out on these things and you sit in Rally HQ and you're broadcasting from the media centre or whatever, and you're effectively talking to yourself. But the other side of the world, it's popping out of people's car radios and their radios at home, and it was really bringing rallying to certainly a British audience that had never really had that done before. That was fantastic. Because it was all new to me, I don't think it was really... It really kind of sunk in how short the season was. It was only later, when we were up to the sort of 10, 11 events, or, we were also in a period of events rotating. So that, for example, 95, Colin's championship year, fantastic. 96, the RAC rally wasn't even a round of the championship. So that was my first year working for telly. And you had the likes of, Armin Schwartz and Kankkunen going off and things on the RAC, but it was a non-championship year. But 95 was great in a way, because we didn't have so many events to worry about. But it was funny looking back at the Chris Harris story on Top Gear the other day. All the stories came flooding back. The Carlos getting injured, the whole business with Colin kicking the rubbish bin in Catalonia, the team orders, the whole that sort of thing. Boy, had I known at the beginning of the year what the stories would have been as the year went on, I think we'd have probably sold it to 10 times the number of radio stations. The Toyota story was obviously one of the biggies during the year, and I think there were a few people that were starting to question. There was certainly, the journalists kind of all knew each other, and we went out for dinner, and you'd bump into people, and there was quite often somebody who'd have a conspiracy theory who would try and get somebody else to float it and then go, hey, the BBC's saying it must be true, or whatever. And I tried to avoid getting sucked into that trap, although unfortunately it did happen once or twice over the time that I did the WRC. But with the Toyota thing, because it was so big, because it was done in the way that it was, nobody could really believe it. And so, that whole business in Australia, where they were so quick at Langley Park, and again, when, watching Top Gear, the drag race, the sprint away from the start line, and, Kankkunen was, 2 seconds up or 100 yards ahead or whatever it was at the end of the straight. That's when people started thinking what was going on. And then by the time we arrived in Catalonia, again, they kind of picked up where they left off. So had they found something amazing? Well, now, of course, we know the reason why they were so quick, and clearly they hadn't found anything amazing. They'd found a way of cheating. But the way that it broke, as I understand it, there was a whistleblower who went to the FIA and said, look, you need to know something. And the way that it was discovered was that there was a special tool. And they were so blatant about it that the tool was hanging up on the back door of the van. And the FIA technical delegate, chap called Jacques Berger, went into the service park and found the tool and took the tool away with him. And it was that moment that Toyota went, oh no, we're in trouble here. He knows what the tool is. And they, at the end of Catalonia, they impounded the car. They packed up. The team disappeared. They were heading to the airport, and they left a lady called Alexandra Sheeran, who was the office junior in the media centre. She was left to carry the can, and of course the story broke, and everyone just descended on poor Alexandra. And she went on, to become a good friend, but also she ended up being the F1 media delegate. She had a fantastic career in Formula One and in motorsport generally. But that was a real baptism of fire for her, because it all kicked off and she was the one left holding the baby. And the senior management, who should have been there asking questions, was legging it back to Cologne. I'd never seen... Obviously, I was still the new boy. It was my first season. But we were invited out to dinner by DR, by David Richards, who was boss of the ProDrive team. And he said to us the night before, guys, just for you to be aware, we're on the verge of both titles here. So we've decided that we are going to impose team orders Carlos is ahead at the moment and Colin is second, so we've told them that's the way it'll finish. And we were absolutely gobsmacked. And, you know, me being, again, the new boy, I didn't know whether this was how it was done, whether the broadcasters, whether the journalists, whether the photographers, you know, were told the night before, hey guys, we've imposed team orders, and then that would make you look good by saying, but of course team orders are in place, so Colin McCrae will not win this rally. And of course that's not what happened. That final day, Colin, being Colin, went flat out. Carlos took it as read that he was going to finish first, so he backed off. He then came under attack from Colin. I think you saw again the response from Carlos on the interview, and it was quite, the Top Gear piece for me was great because Carlos said, you know, Colin and I became the firmest of friends, although people thought we were the sworn enemies because of what had happened. But he said, you know, he was going for it. He was a professional driver, as was I. And you know that sequence, the onboard sequence at the end of the stage, where you had Nigel Lilly and John Spiller and David Lapworth, I think, was there right on the flying finish, or just before the flying finish of the final stage in Catalonia. And you've got Nigel looking at his watch and stepping out into the road to flag Colin down. And of course, Colin doesn't even lift. He's flat past him. And then, you know, it all kicked off afterwards and he had to take the penalty and he kicks the bin and everything else. And for David Richards, I think that was the biggest thing was the loss of face in that he'd told us all the night before this was going to happen and it didn't. And it was very embarrassing and very public. And they had to stage manage it and it kind of left a nasty taste in a lot of people's minds. I'll let you into a secret. One of the biggest tellings off I've ever had, if that's the right way of describing it, was I was asked by ProDrive to do a live stage show, if you like, and present a Q&A with Colin and Carlos just before the start in Chester. So they got me up in, you know, ProDrive team clothing and whatever. So we were up on stage and I had Colin and Carlos did the interview. What do you think is going to happen? Where do you think this rally is going to be won and lost? Can you beat Carlos? Can you beat Colin? And then at the end, my biggest mistake, I said to the crowd, right, you know, you tell us your opinion. You've heard from these two guys. Who thinks Carlos is going to be world champion? Hooray! Who thinks Colin's going to be world champion? Brace yourself. You know, all the roofs in Chester lifted off, and Carlos was furious and let it be known to the team, who then came back and told me that really wasn't a smart move, and that had rattled Carlos and had got him angry the day before. So I kind of slunk off a bit with my sort of tail between my legs, but I don't really regret it, to be honest. It was a fun thing to do, and I think in the heat of the moment, it was one of those things that actually might have given Colin a bit of a psychological boost and given Carlos a bit of a step down, maybe, I don't know. But it was something that I got a big telling off for. On the event itself, I was actually in Rally HQ exactly as I had been for all of the other rounds around the world, where I was in the press office and there was a little radio booth set aside for me. So I was doing the hourly updates and whatever to the stations that we were feeding. And then when it all finished, Greg Strange had been out on the road, and Greg came back and said, you know, I think we need to speak to Colin. And he said, there's a service point just down the road. Could you go? So I said, yep. Having not been out on the road at all for the event, I jumped in the car, looked at the map, saw where the service point was. Of course, we had all the right stickers to get in there. So I drove down. It was absolute chaos. And it's the shot that you'd have seen where, you know, Colin drives in and everyone's just going berserk. And I managed to get probably about a minute and a half with him. And it was, you know, Colin, well done. How do you feel? You know, all the obvious questions. And I zipped back to Rally HQ, pumped it down to all of the radio stations. And of course, within the hour, Colin was back. So you then had the far more kind of antiseptic questions that were being asked, you know, once the passion had died down and he'd done the donuts outside, and it was then, you know, he was then in interview mode, which is something that he didn't really like. But it was all a bit downbeat and a bit low key, whereas the interview I did with him, you know, an hour and a half before on the road, we had the passion, we had the cheering, we had everything else, and that probably to me is one of my favourite interviews of the 8 years that I covered the WRC. the following year, the British interest snowballed, really exploded. Greg and I unfortunately fell out. Greg's obviously, if you know the story, is sadly no longer with us. We did make up at the end. We were talking. We had a half decent relationship at the end, but I decided at the beginning of '96 that I was going to go my own sweet way. And by then the BBC had said, would you work for us in telly? 5 Live had come and said, would you work for us as well? So on the event, I was doing hourly reports back for 5 Live and the other BBC stations. And then afterwards, I would go into an edit suite in Birmingham and do the voiceover for the worldwide programme that BBC Pebble Mill was doing. And that was year 2. And in fact, that was year 96, 97, I think, and 98. So that was a really good period working for Auntie Beeb. And then after that, 99, 2000, 2001 was BBC Sport in London. So not doing radio, but purely doing telly. So I'll always be grateful to Greg, even though we had our fallings out and there were times where we barely spoke. But, he was the one that set me up for my 8 years doing the WRC, and I'll always be grateful for that. But yeah, you're right. 96. Oh, Colin's going to win this again, surely. No. The interest from the UK was, what's Colin doing? And then if he retired or if he had a bad rally, oh well, there's always one in a couple of weeks' time. Then, of course, you started to see Richard Burns come up and start to be on the scene. And I was lucky enough to be there reporting on Richard's first win in Safari. Then I was there for his championship year. So, my period of covering the WRC really was one of the golden eras of rallying, and certainly in terms of the British audience, where I covered both British World Champions, and so lucky to have been there.
Absolute Rally, the season of 95.
I don't know, it's difficult to say because with the new regulation, I think many drivers can win this year because we don't know the choice of tire and we don't know the condition of the weather, and it's very difficult to give you a prognostic, and I have no idea at the moment. You cannot be concentrate on 40 kilometer stage and after to do 30 minute mechanics. I change the brake, the front brake. I remove also the studs on the tire. Then normally you have 30 minutes to be relaxed and to have some rest, and you have to do some mechanics. Then this is really stupid.
Notwithstanding his aversion to spanner work, Delacour now was in a real position to challenge for the lead. Ably supported by the Belgian Bruno Thierry in the second escort. The RAS Motorsport prepared car was performing perfectly. Despite some problems with tyre choices in the rapidly changing conditions, Thierry would start the third and final leg in a strong 6th place. Delacour gave it everything he knew, but he couldn't quite make it to the first position. Overall, though, it's a Ford 1-2, with Bruno Thierry and Francois Delacour heading the field. Oriol third in his Toyota, ahead of the Subarus of Sainz and Liati. Aghini 6th, McCrae 7th, Bernardini 8th, Kankkunen and Mäkinen round out the top 10 as the final day dawns. And it dawns with Bruno Thierry in emphatic command. Fastest on the opening 2 special stages of the day, he extends his lead. Thierry looks like a man that can't be beaten. But around the corner, at the next service area, disaster looms. Officially, it's only a refueling point. That means that Thierry has to carry out any maintenance himself.
It was not really a service, it was a refueling, and for the mechanics it was not possible to change the parts. And I tried to repair by myself, but it was not possible. For the mechanics it was not possible to change the part. And I think it was, for them it was only, for sure, only 10 minutes to change this part. And now was not possible for us to keep the lead, and now we are out the race.
I wanted to get an idea of what my Absolute Rally podcast colleagues were up to during 1995, so I thought I'd collar our own Jack Benyon and Ryan Champion about what they were doing. First up, Jack tells his tales of being at the racecourse, and then Ryan Champion talks about a ferry trip home.
For me, the memory of 1995 has to be Chester Racecourse, and I know it's perhaps a little bit of a cop-out for some people who remember the event well and remember those pictures and the celebrations that were happening at Chester Racecourse with Colin and the Subaru team and all the fans that lined the racecourse and outside as well. But for me, it's kept 1995 alive on a day-to-day basis. I lived in Chester from the age of 9. I was at the racecourse at the age of 3 when Colin was doing the donuts, and the racecourse and 1995 as a World Rally Championship season are still just as alive to this day to me as they were in 1995, because I don't actually remember seeing Colin doing the donuts. I just know I was there because my dad took me there, and it was part of our joining into motorsport, so to speak. So for me, going into college, going into school, going into the local town centre every day involved going past Chester Racecourse, and every time you come over the Grosvenor Bridge and head just over where the racecourse is to the left, you can see down to that car park where Colin did the donuts and where the finishing ramp was, where all the people stood. There's a very famous lip in the road just to the left that overlooks that car park, where people can watch the horse racing for free if you don't want to pay to get in. It's a bit of a distance away, but you can see, and you definitely would have been in right up close to watch Colin, doing the celebrations in 1995 there. And anyone who knows Chester will know this area very well. There used to be a really old police station building there, which was really, really ugly, and it can be seen from the back of some of the pictures in 1995. But now it's been exchanged for an abode hotel where there's penthouse suites and also a really nice hotel at the top, and you can actually go out on the balcony at the Abode Hotel and look over the car park now. So for me, the racecourse is not a single memory, it's not a one event. For me, 1995 is very much still alive. It's one of the greatest events in rallying history for a British rally fan, which fundamentally is how I started as a fan. And Chester has so many rally memories for me. My granddad was the foreman of Quick's Garage and would drive Roger Clark's Ford Escort Mark 1 around Chester in the middle of the night after servicing the car in the RAC rally, and having Colin celebrate being the first British World Rally Champion in Chester, in what is my hometown. It just means rallying is alive in a way which I don't really think it probably is in a lot of other cities in the UK or around the world. So that memory is something that is continuous, something that is living and breathing, and something that I can feel every time I cross that bridge and head into Chester City Centre. And one of the key reasons why I got into rallying, and I know so many others did, and there's an on-rushing joke now that people say that there's more people now who remember being at Chester Racecourse than were actually there, because people like to embellish the truth and say they were there. And do you know what? I'd probably say I wasn't there, because I wasn't there in memory. As I said, I was 3 years old at the time, so it was quite an odd memory to pick.
So my first memory of the 1995 season, it was something that happened by accident, actually. I'd been to John Hoglan's rally school in Norway with several other well-known British rallying faces: Justin Dale, Neil Simpson, Jock Armstrong. There's a whole load of stories there, but for one reason or another we missed our ferry, and the one we ended up coming back to the UK on just happened to have the Mitsubishi Rally Art team on board as well, and they just won the Swedish Rally with Kenneth Eriksson. So that was a 95 Swedish, and it was an overnight boat, and to say the boat was lively that night was a bit of an understatement. So it was a great atmosphere, great party on the boat. So that's sort of how I remember the 95 World Championship season kicking off. For me, it was my first year in the British Championships. I was kind of focusing on that. So I guess the next thing really that I remember about the WRC season is coming round to New Zealand again, which was it was always Colin McCrae's favoured rally, I think, by that point. I mean, obviously, it went very well in GB as well, but he just made New Zealand his own rally. And I remember watching from a distance and seeing that Colin did what he did best there, and just there were certain stages. I think Motu Road was the famous one where he could just take so much time out of all the opposition, and he won New Zealand again. And obviously with Carlos's mountain bike accident, then it gave him a real chance at the World Championship. And I think all of us will remember Rally Catalunya, what happened, and I think although I wasn't there, it's still clear in my mind seeing those TV pictures of the ProDrive team trying to slow Colin down on the last stage to let Carlos win, and then that famous footage of Colin kicking the bin over in the service area when he was told he had to finish second. And I think it was Rob Arthur at the time that was trying to get an interview with Colin, and an incredibly disgruntled Colin, but it meant that Colin and Carlos obviously went into the Network Q rally pretty much equal on points. And I went spectating on the RAC rally that year in '95 with Justin Dale, and a couple of things sort of stick in my mind. I remember Hamsterley, I think, was the first proper stage of the rally on day 2 after the spectator stages, and Colin just wiped everybody. He wiped the floor. I think he was like 30 seconds up on Carlos, and fastest by 28 or something like that. And it was an incredible time, and obviously that put him into the lead. And then he got a puncture on the very next stage. I think it was like a 40-mile stage or something like that in Pundershaw. Probably just as well it was a long stage, because it meant that the puncture cost him less time, because he would have been very quick on the rest of it. But that put him behind, and I remember seeing him on the road section. I remember seeing him like trying to I think it damaged the suspension or did something on the steering, and there was a big crowd around the car at the roadside. But that just set the stage, didn't it, for this epic battle where Colin had to come from behind, catch Carlos, and Carlos must have, really just felt the pressure on his shoulders, because he had Colin on his home rally with massive support. There was huge crowds everywhere, and Colin was just catching him stage after stage. And I think probably Carlos must have known even before Colin caught him that he wasn't going to keep McCrae behind for the rally or the championship. And I was lucky enough to be in the grandstand in Chester when Colin was doing the donuts, and I remember him going up to get that trophy, that gold trophy, and losing the lid off the trophy, and the whole crowd went wild. And it's not only was it Colin McCrae winning the World Rally Championship, but the way he won it, to be so quick on that rally, to dominate, to do the donuts, it's just a whole thing around it. And I think that's one of the reasons why Colin McCrae is held in such regard today, that he was whilst he was relatively quiet out of the car, he did his talking in the car, and he was this flamboyant driver, spectacular, always did it his way. He was always the fastest, always the most spectacular, and that's why we'll always love Colin McCrae.
This is Absolute Rally, the season of '95.
From rally fans, I guess now it's only natural to move to the teams, and the first team I wanted to start with, which was one which I probably had a little bit of a soft spot for, which was the Ford team. And it was a person I wanted to reach out to who's been with Ford throughout many decades. Started off at RED, went to Boredom, and finished his career quite recently retiring at M Sport. John Millington has been in and around the service park for close on 30 years, and he seemed a really good person to reach out to and talk to about the 95 season and what the Blue Oval was planning and what they got up to.
Myself and Trevor Godden were joint coordinators. Basically, Trevor worked at Boredom before I did with Jim Porter, and then they asked me to come along and help Trevor. Unbeknown to me, the idea was Jim was going to leave and retire. So after we'd done a couple of rallies, he then announced the fact that he was retiring and left it just for Trevor and myself. So that's how I ended up working with Trevor. He kind of, if you like, he was the lead coordinator, and I always used to say, I'll do all the stuff you don't want to do, in effect.
Was this jobs like that always seem to be like co-drivers though? Never like drivers, is there? You never have drivers trusted to do things like that. It's always co-drivers.
I know, it's not fast enough for drivers, you see, that's the trouble.
So 95, obviously, John, is something that we all kind of look back on. Obviously, it was very famous because we got our first, British world champion. But there was so many other stories and so many other teams, and Boreham was very much a place which I suppose we were all a bit giddy about Boreham. Boreham, I think, to rally fans was like Disneyland, because obviously people remember the Mark IIs coming up and things like that. So you were working there, and we were coming into this era now of Group A. Can you remember that kind of era of the Group A car first coming about, and obviously Ford's foray with the Escort Cosworth coming into this season?
Obviously, I don't remember a lot on the technical side because our office was remote from the workshop, and they didn't let me anywhere near the workshop because all I wanted to do was to go reset the points and stuff like that, which had gone years ago. So I was definitely banned from there. But no, I remember lots of meetings and things like this. But Ford as a factory team, what I think you've got to really appreciate to understand it clearly is it was run as a publicity vehicle for Ford as a company. So every year they had to present a budget to the board of directors at Ford as to how they could justify spending this amount of money to get this amount of publicity back. Well, we were just coming into an era then when Ford themselves were not seeing the value for money. Now, you could say part of that is the fact that they didn't utilise the results that the motorsport got. I also personally think they never actually appreciated the value of Boreham and Ford in rallying and in motorsport. As a consequence of this, Boreham was offered a budget which wasn't sufficient to do the 8 rounds of the World Championship then, because we were right into the middle of the rotation system. So although there was something like 12 or 13 WRC events, only 8 of them counted for the main Group A championship. As a consequence of this, there was a private team in Belgium called Rasport who had a very, very wealthy owner and a budget, and fancied, I think, looking back now in hindsight, the opportunity to become the factory team. So they offered to go into partnership with Boreham and run a joint team, which effectively was a Ford factory team, but badged and marketed as Rasport. This merger wasn't without a lot of problems, I have to say, because you can imagine a factory team. Anybody who's worked in one will know all the paperwork, all the procedures, all the things you've got to go through in order to make a competition department work within the concept of a mainstream car factory. Obviously, the private team's big advantage is flexibility and speed and reaction to change things. So they initially found it very, very difficult and complicated. If they wanted to do something, we had to say, oh, in that case, we have to put a paper in for that and get permission and all this stuff. So initially, they found it very difficult. However, on the plus side, they were very, very nice, very good people to work with. They did bring a lot of ideas, a lot of expertise to the party, if you like, and some really good people. I mean, the one that stands out was their chief mechanic, a chap called Reno, who used to be famous for working at Lancia, and he became like the lead mechanic. And as a result, there was a lot of things got done that we couldn't actually do prior to him coming along because of his expertise.
Wow. Is that why, one of my favourite drivers of all time, and I don't know why, but he was always happy, was Bruno Thierry. I'm guessing Bruno got his gig through the fact that it was a Belgian team, I'm guessing.
Partly, yes. Obviously, they wanted people that they've obviously had a marketing aspect as well. So they had sponsors both in Italy and Belgium that they had to satisfy, so they needed Bruno. I mean, Bruno was a fantastic person, a very, very kind person. His biggest problem was he was too nice. And unfortunately, he wasn't ruthless enough when it came down to the cut and thrust of winning the World Championship Rally. The biggest doubt or the biggest regret or sadness of that whole year was his Corsica result. When
I was just about to ask about that, yeah.
He was as surprised as all the rest of us. He couldn't understand. He looked bemused like a kiddie at Disneyland why the times were just coming, and it just clicked. And him and Stefan, they just hit the right note. They hit the ground running. They were fastest to start with. And unfortunately, due to a broken wheel bearing at the back, which cost them the rally in the end, 2 stages from the end. I mean, that was absolutely heartbreaking. But it was fantastic to see him finally get to be leading a rally. And amazing the number of people that came up to wish him well and congratulate him. And I think he was surprised and taken back by, if you like, his fan base or his supporters that obviously he'd never come in contact with because he'd always been 4th or 5th or something like this, and all of a sudden they were there, and he suddenly realised that, you know, how popular he was. It was a heartbreaking finish to that rally, unfortunately.
You also had the legendary, probably the one who we all thought was going to be, you know, I suppose at that period we talk about the Sebs of these eras, which was Francois Delacour, and you know the steely eyes, the I don't know how he could possibly drive sitting so close to that steering wheel, but what was Delacour like to deal with?
Again, he was a character. That's the best way of putting it. A very determined character. Very, very demanding in what he wanted, but he had this uncanny knack of carrying speed through a corner, and other drivers, they couldn't understand how he could do it to get the speed through the corner, and it was all to do with his delicate car control. The downside of this was that obviously most of the cars, the setups, the way things were structured in a 2-car team were based around him. Now, unless you had his skill and this delicacy of driving and carrying this speed through, you couldn't get the car to work. And unfortunately, Bruno did struggle a lot to actually get the performance out of the car that Francois could get because of his driving skill. I mean, it was a very loud character, shall I say, shouting and demanding, but I think a lot of this was through frustrations at himself that he couldn't get the results or the speed out of the car that he wanted, and he couldn't understand why. What he needed was a very, very good engineer to work with him, which at Ford, with Reno and Philip Donovan and people like that, he did eventually settle into that, and by the end of the year they got a really good working relationship. But no, he certainly was a character. The one I feel sorry for was poor Kathleen sitting next to him.
I've got to ask about the infamous almost 7-speed box that came and went throughout that season as well. I know you said you weren't involved with the technical side of it, but was it really as ill-fated as what we all remember it as?
Yes. As I said earlier on in this interview, one of the downsides of working with a factory team within a factory situation is the time it takes to actually make something happen. When the box was conceived and the idea floated and the designs made, it made perfect sense. But then we had a bigger restrictor, less restrictions on all other aspects of the car. We had slick tyres and things like that. As the cars became more controlled in order to bring the cost down, and we had the smaller restrictor, which meant that the engines worked in a different characteristic, the complexity of 7 speeds wasn't needed. It wasn't to say that the box was wrong, it was just that you didn't need 7. The torque and everything that was coming out of the engines with a smaller restrictor and the way they were starting to map them and get them to work meant you didn't need it. So you were carrying an extra gear for nothing. The box was not a particularly strong box. Whether this was the fact they were trying to cram too much into the limitations of the casing or what they had to work with, I don't know, or whether it just wasn't designed really good to start with. But it was one of these things that, unfortunately, the drivers got into their heads that was the thing that was slowing them down. So it didn't matter what you did with the car. Oh, it's a 7-speed box. Now, obviously, when they got rid of that and went back to a 6-speed box mid-season, once they could homologate it, that took away that problem. So then it was a case of, well, you haven't got that problem now. Now why aren't you quick? And, of course, then the other sort of aspects of the car came more into focus, that they had to look at developing things like the rear suspension and stuff like that to try and get the car to be more competitive.
The other thing that kind of happened around that time, and it wasn't just for you guys, but certainly across the board with all the teams, you know, their drivers were parachuted in, and the list of their drivers that you guys had, obviously, Steve Blomqvist, Alex Florio, Neil Allport. You know, I can kind of understand the likes of Neil Allport, obviously because of where he's based. So obviously for Australia and New Zealand, that was perfect. Stig, I'm guessing, was obviously a no-brainer for Sweden. When you start looking at these drivers, you know, I'm assuming importers are the ones that are paying for these third cars. Is that how it worked for you guys?
Well, it was all part of the marketing strategy, because obviously the budget was coming from Ford of Europe, not Ford of Great Britain. So you had to look at what was best for the marketing in each individual country. So, like you've just said, for Sweden, Stig was a household name. He sold cars, so that's the object of putting him in. None of it was done financially. So, in other words, there wasn't like, oh, we'll give you more money from Ford Sweden if you take Stig, that sort of thing. It was all done in order to, when the budgets were put in at the start of the year, in order to justify the fact that the money's coming from Ford of Europe, that we will put in to a World Championship car your local driver or what, somebody who's going to be a household name in that particular country. The driver was not chosen by the countries, it was chosen by Boredom.
Did obviously you could see what was going on across the service park as well? Was there glances across the service park? Because obviously we know, you know, the benefits now knowing who was the world champion then, but obviously the McCraes had such history with Ford, you know, obviously Jimmy with obviously the Sierra Cosworth, obviously even Colin to some degree to the Sierra Cosworth. Was there perhaps some glances across the service park of maybe having, you know, a Brit in the car? Did that even come up, bearing in mind what you've just been saying about the European budget?
No, because I think at that time Colin was the one, and he was firmly entranced with Subaru. The up and coming Brit, if you like, as far as Ford was concerned, was Gwyndaf, and he was running the Super 2000 in the British Championship, and they entered him in a couple of World Championship events, obviously GB, which he won. As a result of that, they ran Gwyndaf in Indonesia the following year. Again, it was a way to try and bring on, if you like, a younger driver as such. Whether they would have been better looking at Alistair McCrae more than Gwyndaf, I don't know, but the decision was taken to use Gwyndaf. The other thing with Gwyndaf, he used to do a lot of work at Boredom, doing endurance testing and car testing, tyre testing and things like that. And I actually got to know him quite well through his testing. The fact he was at Boredom quite a lot, doing all the, if you like, the laborious stuff, because that's the one thing Francois wouldn't do, was the laborious driving round and round and round to make sure things were okay, endurance testing and stuff like that. So it's sort of had a behind the scenes situation with Gwyndaf that he was the one they were looking at from Ford of Britain's side.
If, as we look towards how the season finished, was the fact that, we did have, obviously, Colin become world champion. Obviously, Richard was coming through, of course, as well as that time. Rallying, certainly to me at that point, I was 19 years old. Rallying all of a sudden became mainstream again. For a very, there was a window of time where rallying became mainstream again. From your point of view, obviously, is that something you were talking about? Obviously, fights with budgets and stuff like that. Was that something that perhaps Ford looked at? Did they see the benefits of what was happening in rallying, or did they not actually think, well, it's worth putting any more money into this because we've now got people paying for it, so maybe that's not the way for us to go?
Yeah, I mean, from a personal aspect, I know what you're saying. I personally think Ford did not use the results of rallying and what they had in rallying to its maximum. There could have been a lot more benefit in what was actually happening at Boreham, what was happening in the World Championship, what was happening in the UK with Colin. Because the spin-off of that, it's not just the fact Colin wins it, Subaru see it. People think, okay, that's Subaru, but they're Japanese. What's British Ford? And the spin-off came back to Ford, but then didn't kind of utilise it. And there was a little bit of this, if you think, like the Ford Mexico, for example, that was a brilliant example of how to utilise a fantastic result into a marketing tool and make money at it, because they certainly did make money at it, the amount of cars they sold. They could have pushed it more, advertised it more. I mean, can you imagine if Ford offered trips round Boreham, like, for example, M Sport do now around their workshop? The queue would be as long as you get outside a supermarket now. It would be a fantastic thing. And it was never opened up like that, and it should have been. And I think part of it is that you're working within the concept of a massive manufacturer, which is not a bad thing. There's a lot of pluses to that side, but you don't have the freedom to do a lot of these things because, for example, you can't wander into a Ford factory and have a look around. And Boreham, is, in their eyes, is another Ford factory, just in a different location. So the concept means that they have to take it out of Ford, take it out of that mindset, and say, right, this is a marketing tool now, let's try and sell it, or let's try and do it. I mean, all it takes is a little badge on the side of a car, we won so-and-so, or the sticker in the back window or something like that. I mean, look at Seat, World Championships in the back of all these Seats, and then in small letters it says F2. But it says World Championship in big letters, which is great. They've done it. People see that. Oh, World Championship rallying. Oh, that's that Colin McCrae thing.
And it's funny you say that, because you think about, if somebody says Seat to me, still to this day, I think bright yellow.
Yes.
And we think Subaru, we think gold wheels, blue car.
Yeah. And
you ask any punter on the street of an age, even if they're not motorsport fans, they're the answers you're going to get. They're going to be the stock answers. And Seat absolutely nailed it during that period. I completely and utterly agree with you.
But if you think about it, Subarus were pickups that farmers used, and all of a sudden they became the cult car to have. The other perfect example is Peugeot's. Rattly old 404 that the family doctor had, or the family vet, and all of a sudden they bring out the T16, and it, again, is the cult car to have. It's still there today. People still want a GTI Peugeot.
Yeah, amazing. So, for you, 95. Is it one that is it one of regret or frustration when you look back from your point of view of what went on during that season?
From me, first of all, I got a lot, along with Trevor, a lot of satisfaction in actually getting this thing to work, the Rasport thing. I mean, there was such a lot to sort out to try and merge a private team into a factory team. Now, Rasport were based at Charleroi, just over into Belgium, and the number of times that we left Boreham, drove down, went on the train under the Channel Tunnel up to Charleroi for meetings all day long, and then came back that night. I mean, we even went to 7 o'clock one night. We left work at sort of 5, down there, did the meeting, and we were back home at 10 o'clock that night. But there was such a lot of things to try and resolve. I mean, for example, language, they spoke French, so we had to say, right, the team language is English, so we had to do a lot of work to make sure all the paperwork from their side and our side was in English. All the equipment, all the build of the cars, they're integrating their mechanics into the Boreham setup, their vans and things like this, and their way of working. It did work. Like I said, they were really, really good people to work with. So from my point of view, and I think Trevor would say the same if ever you spoke to him about it, that period, a lot of it came on us to try and coordinate and get the thing to actually physically work and run, so it looked like a team from the outside. The year itself, to be honest, I don't particularly remember a lot about the year, apart from Bruno in Corsica. Some of the long-haul events, I have vague memories of those sort of thing, but there was nothing really that stood out. Obviously the Toyota thing, which I have to say, for once, the drivers were right, because both Francois and Bruno would turn around to us during the year and say, there's no way that car should be as fast, we need more power. And it's a thing that drivers always say, because they always compare with the other team, and you just dismiss it and think, well, it's just because they've beaten you, that's why. And sure enough, in this instance, they were correct. And obviously, the great pleasure, personally, was GB when Colin won, because I'd worked with Colin at RED for a long time, and with Jimmy, of course. So it was really nice to see it all come together at last, and he got the World Championship, which was brilliant. And of course, it was in Chester, so it wasn't that far from home.
Absolute Rally, the season of 95.
So how could Colin McCrae take so much time off one of the best in the world?
I think we can do nothing. For me, just try to keep Johan Kankkunen behind me, but it's impossible to catch Colin McCrae.
Kankkunen's drive in the closing stages was certainly one of the most spectacular. Braving the frost-covered stages of the New Zealand spring,
50.
Kankkunen was at his absolute best.
50, very long medium left. And long medium right. 70, long fast left.
Nicky Grist reading the pace notes, one corner ahead. Kankkunen planning all the way. Didier Auriol, though, was the fastest of the Cologne-built Japanese cars, despite suffering from understeer in his Celica. But there was nothing Team Toyota Europe could do about the pace of Colin McCrae ahead. Kankkunen and Auriol even joked about the possibility of kidnapping the young Scot.
I don't know. This rally has been really good for me always. I mean, it has been actually best rally in my career if I compare all the other rallies. And I don't know, somehow this road suit very well to my driving style, and I like it, and the country is very good as well.
So from the Ford perspective, we now cross over to Service Park, over to Toyota. Obviously, the elephant in the room of this season is what went on behind the scenes and what truly happened with regards to Turbogate. And one man who was sat in one of the cars, he was sat alongside Johan Kankkunen, he was pushing for that championship, was Nicky Grist, and he joined our own Ryan Champion to talk about 95 from his perspective.
Well, fantastic to have Nicky Grist with us to talk about the 1995 season. Nicky, you were coming into your third year alongside Johan Kankkunen. what was the plan for the 95 season? I guess it was to aim for the championship again with Juha.
Well, ultimately, yes. I mean, having sat with him in 93, he won the championship. Then in 94, Juha said to Uwe Andersson that he'd take over some test and development work of the new ST205 Celica, while Didier stuck with the old 185 Celica to win the 94 championship. But in 95, we all moved over to the ST205, which, you know, the early part of 94, it was a little frustrating with the car. There were some suspension issues, which they had to revert back to some older design stuff. So, you know, we were optimistic, but the 205 was a lot bigger car than the 185 Celica, and in many ways didn't quite feel as nimble and as nice to drive perhaps as the 185. So we knew that with the test and development work we'd be able to improve through the 95 season.
But you had a good start nonetheless, despite maybe reservations. You were in the mix for the championship early on.
Well, we were, but it was a funny old season, 95, because with Carlos having a little sabbatical in the middle part of the year with an injury and, you know, everything else, while we didn't win anything, we had a steady classic Juha Kankkunen season where he's still plugging away, getting good results, finishing in the top few, collecting all those points, and, you know, by the time we got towards the end of the season, we were in there with a shout, and we were leading the championship. And you know, by the time we'd done Australia, we were in the lead, and it was looking pretty good. And all we had at the end of the day was 2 rounds of the championship left in Catalonia and Rally GB. And you know, we were confident enough that we could pull something off.
So that took you into to Catalonia, but Catalonia didn't really go to plan, did it?
No, not quite. And I think it was. I mean, everybody knows about the classic cheat and all the rest of it that TT came up with, while a wonderful piece of engineering, and you know, in all the pre-event preparations, nobody had picked it up. But you know, we basically had. We tried it. They told us that we've got a new evolution of the engine and we want you to try it. And this was in Langley Park in Australia, which is a super special by the service park in front of everybody. And it started on a tarmac road, 2 cars side by side, and we rocketed off the start line. And by the time we'd done 200 meters, we were about 2 car lengths ahead. And that was the first time we'd ever tried this thing. Well, of course, you know, I mean, it was a bit like doing your dirty washing in public, really. And at the end of the day, everybody thought, hang on, what the hell's going on there? What's that all about? That was the first time we'd used it. We'd gone through the rally, and we hadn't used it at all. And, you know, so then we finished that event, and we were in control of the championship, really. And we went to Catalonia, and the first day, you know, you had worked a lot on his tarmac driving, and, you know, we'd, you know, in fairness to him, he was beating Didier Auriol and everybody, and we were leading the rally after the first day. So, you know, that said, we were absolutely delighted. And we basically went to service in Lorette de Mar that evening, and TT in the normal style, going through everything, changing turbos, because we change a turbo every day. And anyway, there was a scrutineer at each car. So when we took the old turbo off and put a new turbo on, apparently the scrutineer said, "Thank you very much, we'll take this now." And they took all the turbos. So we were obviously unaware of what was going on, completely unaware, because we were just told, literally, it was an evolution of the engine. So we left Lorette de Mar the next morning. I think we were first car on the road, and went to the first service point, and the head engineer, or overall engineer, was looking a little bit of a worried man in the service point, and chain smoking, you know, 2 cigarettes at a time virtually. And he said, "Good luck today, Nicky. I hope it all goes well." And I said, "Thank you very much. Thank you very much." and off we sped. And I think we did a couple of stages, and unfortunately we had an off and we rolled. So we were out of the rally anyway. So that was that. I mean, championship wasn't over for us because we had Rally GB to go. But unfortunately, we later that day, of course, then it all came out. They found what TT had done, and
for us it was a bit of a shock because all our efforts had come completely to an end. All championship points were taken away from every member of the Toyota team. Manufacturers' points, everything gone, and a massive, I think it was $250,000 fine. And that was basically our championship done, which obviously then handed over the championship battle to Team Subaru, and between Colin and Carlos. And the rest really is history.
And you had to obviously stand by and watch that championship battle, but what was the reaction from yourselves within the team, and what was the reaction towards you about this ban? I assume everybody thought that you were in on it and you would know what was going on.
Well, yeah, I think it's come up in conversation a number of times with people since, and people can't believe that we knew nothing about it, and that was absolutely the case. The engine shop very much was a closed area, and there was very few people allowed in there, so nobody really knew what was going on other than certain individuals in the hierarchy. And people have said that even Ulve Andersson didn't know about this. So in many ways it was it really was a very top secret thing, but while it gave it extra performance, I think if for any reason, if Toyota hadn't have chosen for us to use it in Langley Park in Australia, nobody would have ever known, because it was just, if off any normal start line, nobody would ever know, would they? They had nothing to match it against.
No, and you're quite right. It was very obvious with where it was used. I guess it must have been quite a shock for yourselves, though, to be in that position as well.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a nice situation, obviously not. And to have to lose the championship on something like that. But I know that Toyota had been promised to win the championship, and I don't know whether that would have had a bearing on the head engineer. What was his name? I got to remember his name now. That's a sign of age for you, Ryan. But he went to Dieter Bulling. Dieter Bulling, I think, was the main man at that time. And obviously for him it was pretty serious. But for the Japanese, who were such honourable individuals, do you know what I mean?
Yes,
they wouldn't have. I'm sure they wouldn't have liked it, but we were never a part of any discussions with the Japanese at all.
So, as you said, that meant not only were you excluded from the championship, but you had to sit out your home round of the World Championship. What did you do on that rally, on the 95 Network Q rally, as it was at the time?
Yeah, no, I just sat at home and watched it all unfold. I mean, Colin was always very fast in Britain. I mean, we'd had numerous battles with him, over the years, and generally he would have the upper hand with us on Rally GB, but he would make the odd mistake and then hand it to us on a plate. But in this case, he really did come good and literally controlled it from start to finish. And I think that if you and myself couldn't have won the championship, then I'm really happy that Colin did. Our first British world champion.
And that brings us to the end of the first part of this two-part special that we're making on the 1995 season. We've heard from Toyota, we've heard from Ford. Next up, we're going to have Mitsubishi and Subaru next week, and some other people from behind the scenes of this iconic season as we look back on it. If you've enjoyed it, please tell your friends. Please click the subscribe button. But we'll be back same time, same place, in your little podcast hole with part 2 next week.
The season of 95, an Absolute Rally documentary, produced by Sims Promotions. Spread the word and download the podcast every week. AbsoluteRally.co.uk.